Max Lancaster had spent 20 years surrounded by glass towers, glowing monitors, and the quiet hum of servers that never slept. The city had eaten away at him slowly, in pieces too small to notice, until one day he looked at his own reflection in the window of his office and saw a man who no longer belonged there. That same week, he resigned. He sold his condo, his car, and every reminder of the world that had measured his worth in deadlines and bonuses, and with that money he bought 50 acres of forest at the edge of a forgotten county. No paved roads led there, only a narrow dirt trail that twisted between oaks and pines older than memory itself. The place was wild, untamed, and painfully beautiful. To Max, it felt like stepping out of time. He built a small house by hand. Steel frame, solar panels on the roof, and wide glass walls that opened onto a view of endless green. There was a stream that ran behind the property, clear enough to drink from, and at night, when the frogs began their chorus and the wind moved through the trees, he could almost believe he had erased every trace of the man he used to be. In that solitude, he rediscovered a rhythm of life he'd forgotten existed. He woke with the sunrise, chopped wood, cooked over fire, and wrote code only when he wanted to, not because he had to. His days were measured not by meetings but by how long it took for the mist to lift from the valley. He had no neighbors, no noise, no one telling him how things should be. The forest was his world now, and for the first time in decades he could breathe without feeling observed. He thought he had escaped everything that came with civilization, its rules, its invisible contracts, its hunger for control. He was wrong. It began, quietly, with the sound of engines somewhere beyond the tree line. At first he assumed hunters or a logging crew had taken a wrong turn, but the noise didn't fade. Day after day, he caught glimpses of white survey stakes appearing in the distance like bones sticking out of the ground. He ignored them, convincing himself they were harmless, some mistake that would sort itself out. The land was his. He had the deed in a fireproof safe, notarized, sealed, unquestionable. But one morning, as he brewed coffee and watched the fog roll down from the hills, a vibration trembled through the floorboards. He stepped outside and saw dust rising between the trees. Heavy machinery was moving through his forest. The engine's growl echoed off the hills like a threat. When he walked toward the noise, he saw the soil torn open, roots ripped from the ground, the scent of diesel drowning the smell of pine. A man in a yellow vest waved lazily from behind the wheel of a bulldozer, as if Max's presence there was an inconvenience. He shouted over the engine, demanding to know who authorized this. The worker only shrugged and pointed to a sign newly staked into the earth. Future site of Ridgewood Golf and Country Club, a community project by the Ridgewood HOA. Max read the words twice, his mind refusing to process them. The sign stood on his land. His land. 50 acres he had bought outright. No shared borders, no community agreements, no membership in any association. The absurdity of it was almost comical, until he noticed that the area behind the sign had already been flattened, the first scars of a fairway cutting through what used to be untouched forest. The distant laughter of workers echoed between the trees, mixing with the metallic clang of machinery. It felt like an invasion dressed as progress. For a long moment he simply stood there, surrounded by the sound of destruction, the smell of torn earth filling his lungs, realizing that whatever peace he had come here to find was already slipping through his fingers. The next morning, the forest was unnervingly quiet, the kind of silence that feels deliberate, as if the land itself were holding its breath. Max woke before dawn, unsettled by the thought of that sign, that absurd declaration that his sanctuary was somehow part of something called the Ridgewood Golf and Country Club. He told himself it had to be a misunderstanding, some bureaucratic mistake that a few phone calls could clear up, but when he stepped outside, the air already smelled faintly of fuel and earth, and distant metallic clangs carried through the mist. He followed the noise again, moving through the trees until he reached the clearing where the machines had been the day before. But now there were more of them, bulldozers, graders, trucks filled with gravel and pipes. They had carved a road overnight, a straight wound through the heart of his property. Someone had placed temporary fencing along both sides with plastic flags marked HOA property fluttering in the breeze. He felt a pulse of disbelief give way to fury. When he shouted at the workers, demanding to know who sent them, they didn't even look up. One of them pointed toward a trailer parked at the edge of the clearing. Inside, a man in a polo shirt sat at a folding desk, surrounded by blueprints and coffee cups. The man introduced himself as Site Supervisor for the Ridgewood Development Project, and spoke with the casual arrogance of someone who had been given permission to do whatever he pleased. Max told him the land was privately owned, that they were trespassing, that he would call the police if they didn't leave immediately. The supervisor smirked and said, "You'll need to talk to the association. We have authorization." That word, authorization, hung in the air like a slap. Max demanded to see the paperwork. The man handed him a laminated map showing the area marked in green, labeled Community Recreational Zone. Max pointed to the borders, to his own parcel number, and said, "This area here, this is mine. I own every inch of it." The supervisor shrugged. "Then you should take it up with the Ridgewood HOA. They're the ones paying for the improvements." He turned away as if the conversation were over, signaling for the bulldozer to start again. The engine roared to life, drowning out Max's protest. He stood there, fists clenched, feeling the ground vibrate beneath his boots as the machine chewed another layer of soil. When he finally walked back to his cabin, every step felt heavier, as if the forest were somehow smaller now, as if the noise had already taken something sacred from it. Later that day, as he tried to calm his thoughts, a distant engine stopped, and for the first time in hours, the woods went silent again. That was when he noticed the envelope wedged in his gate. Thick, cream-colored, embossed with the same logo he'd seen on the sign, Ridgewood Homeowners Association. His stomach turned as he tore it open. Inside was a formal letter printed on heavy paper, the kind meant to convey importance. It began with a pleasant greeting. "Dear Mr. Lancaster, as a valued member of the Ridgewood community, we're pleased to inform you that your property has been included in our shared recreational initiative." The next paragraph turned his disbelief into rage. It explained that the HOA had extended community jurisdiction to include his 50-acre parcel as part of a zoning realignment, in accordance with Section 3.4 of the Community Enhancement Agreement. For these upgrades, he was being assessed a development fee of $80,000, payable within 30 days. The letter ended with a line that felt like mockery. "Failure to remit payment may result in liens or further legal action as permitted under association bylaws." Max read it again and again, each word digging deeper. He wasn't part of any community. There were no bylaws, no membership. He had never signed a thing. The name at the bottom, Daniela Sloan, President, was written in a looping, confident signature that radiated entitlement. He felt heat rise to his face as he imagined this woman, whoever she was, sitting in some air-conditioned office deciding that his land was suddenly theirs to play with. He spent the next hours on the phone, first with the county clerk, then the zoning office, then the recorder of deeds. Each call ended the same way: polite confusion, apologies, and then vague references to recent jurisdictional adjustments. One clerk finally said quietly, "It looks like your parcel was reclassified last quarter. You'll have to take that up with the Ridgewood Homeowners Association." That phrase again, "take it up with them," as if the HOA were a government unto itself. He called the number listed on the letter, and after a chain of transfers and automated menus, a woman answered with the practiced calm of someone trained to sound helpful while saying nothing. When he demanded to speak to the president, she told him Ms. Sloan was unavailable but could schedule an appointment next week. He pressed her, voice rising, until she added, Sir, according to our records, your property falls under association oversight as of March 1st. You should have received the updated documents. He hung up before he said something he couldn't take back. The room seemed smaller now, the air heavier. That night, as darkness fell over the forest, he sat outside by the dying light of a fire and stared into the trees that had once promised peace. The bulldozers were gone, but the damage was visible even in the moonlight. The torn stumps, the gouges in the earth, the smell of oil lingering in the air. He realized with a chill that they hadn't simply trespassed. They had claimed ownership, and they had the audacity to charge him for the privilege. Sleep wouldn't come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the sign, the words, "Future site of Ridgewood Golf and Country Club," and imagined strangers walking through his woods, laughing, dragging carts where deer used to move. In the early hours of the morning, he made a decision. At dawn, he would drive into town and find this Daniela Sloane face to face. If they thought they could bury him under paperwork, they were about to learn that some people don't back down just because the law pretends not to see them. The town of Ridgewood looked picturesque from a distance. Neatly painted houses, manicured lawns, and flower beds lined with the same kind of symmetry that spoke more of control than beauty. Max had always found such neighborhoods suffocating, the kind of places where conformity masqueraded as order and individuality was treated like a threat. Driving through its clean streets after hours of winding country roads felt like crossing into enemy territory. The HOA office was located in a glass-fronted building beside a cafe called The Green Cup. The sign above the entrance read, "Ridgewood Community Management," written in a sleek modern font that seemed designed to disarm. Inside, the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and artificial lavender. A receptionist with a perfect smile greeted him without warmth. When he asked to see Daniela Sloane, she looked him up and down, her eyes briefly catching on the dirt on his boots, the flannel shirt that still smelled faintly of pine and smoke. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked. He told her he didn't. She offered a small, controlled smile, the kind that meant, "You're already losing." "Ms. Sloane is very busy today," she said, her tone smooth but final. Max's patience, already thin, began to fray. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "Tell her Max Lancaster is here about the 50 acres your people are bulldozing." The receptionist blinked, the smile wavering just enough to betray recognition. "Please wait," she said, disappearing through a frosted glass door. Minutes passed. The room was silent except for the hum of the air conditioner and the faint tapping of keys from another desk. When the door opened again, a woman stepped out. She was in her 40s, tall, composed, her movements deliberate. Daniela Sloane carried herself like someone who never had to raise her voice to be obeyed. Her suit was cream-colored, expensive but understated, her hair pulled back with mathematical precision. She extended a hand that Max ignored. "Mr. Lancaster," she said pleasantly, "I was just about to contact you. Please, come in." Her office looked like it had been designed to impress investors. Framed certificates on the wall, a table stacked with architectural plans, and a floor-to-ceiling window that looked out over the pristine neighborhood. She gestured to a chair, but Max remained standing. "You're building a golf course on my land," he said flatly. Daniela didn't flinch. "We're developing a community recreational area that includes portions of your property, yes." The calmness in her voice was infuriating. "Portions of my property," he repeated. "It's not portions. It's acres, 50 of them. Mine. Bought and paid for." She folded her hands on the desk, tilting her head as if speaking to a stubborn child. "Mr. Lancaster, I understand your confusion. The zoning committee approved a land use realignment earlier this year. Under the new jurisdictional boundary, your parcel falls within the Ridgewood Development Plan. The Ridgewood HOA now manages shared amenities in that area." Max stared at her, stunned by the audacity of her words. You can't just move a line on a map and claim ownership, he said. That's not how property works. Daniela smiled with the serene patience of someone who had already rehearsed this conversation. All of our actions comply with county regulations. The documents you signed at closing included a clause about community integration. He took a step closer, his voice low and sharp. I read every word of those documents. There was no clause like that. She reached into a folder and pulled out a photocopy of a page covered in dense text. At the bottom, above a blurry signature, were the words, Community Infrastructure Participation Agreement. This, she said, tapping the paper, was included in your deed package. It authorizes the association to maintain and improve land designated for community benefit. Max snatched the page from her hand. The signature looked like his, but faintly off. The curve of the L slightly different. The ink lighter than his pen had ever produced. This is forged, he said, his pulse pounding. Daniela's smile never wavered. If you believe that, you're welcome to pursue it through the courts. She leaned back in her chair, her tone still infuriatingly composed. But I should warn you, legal disputes of this nature are both costly and time-consuming. In the meantime, the development will continue. The room felt suddenly smaller. He imagined the machines tearing through the forest again, the sound of trees falling under steel. You can't do this, he said, almost whispering. You don't have the right. Mr. Lancaster, she replied, folding her hands again, you seem to misunderstand how communities work. We're not taking your property. We're improving it, increasing its value. The golf course will bring tourism, infrastructure, revenue. You'll thank us eventually. He laughed then, a harsh sound that broke through her composure for the first time. You're paving over a forest and calling it improvement. I didn't come here for value. I came here for silence. Daniela's eyes hardened. Silence doesn't pay taxes, she said, and isolation isn't a sustainable business model. You chose to live within our district, Mr. Lancaster. Whether you acknowledge it or not, you're part of this community now. He dropped the forged document onto her desk. If you or your contractor set foot on my land again, I'll have them arrested for trespassing. She gave a soft, almost pitying sigh. That would be difficult, considering the sheriff's department recognizes our jurisdiction. You'll find that legal definitions are more flexible than you think. Max turned to leave. As he reached the door, she added, Oh, and about the fees. Please make sure your payment is processed within the month. Unpaid assessments accumulate penalties. He didn't answer. Outside, the sunlight felt too bright, the air too sharp. As he walked back to his truck, he noticed two men in suits standing near the entrance, pretending to talk but watching him with professional stillness. Something inside him shifted then. Not just anger, but understanding. This wasn't incompetence or bureaucracy. This was a machine built to consume people like him, slow and precise, wrapped in paperwork and politeness. On the drive back, the forest no longer felt like a refuge, but a battlefield waiting to happen. When he arrived home, a new sign had appeared near his driveway. Private construction zone. Entry restricted. Someone had hammered it into the dirt during the few hours he'd been gone. He tore it out with his bare hands, the wood splintering in his grip, and threw it into the trees. He stood there breathing hard, surrounded by the smell of pine and gasoline, realizing with chilling clarity that the fight for his land had already begun, and that the people he was up against didn't need guns or violence. They had something far more dangerous, the law. That night, Max couldn't shake the feeling that his forest was being swallowed piece by piece, not just physically but on paper, in offices where people like Daniela Sloan drew lines and signed forms that rewrote reality. He had spent years designing systems that controlled people, algorithms that shaped behavior, code that decided what others saw and didn't see. And now he realized he had walked straight into a system of another kind, one built not with software but with power disguised as order. The next morning, he woke to the rumble of machinery again, the sound distant but relentless, like a dull heartbeat under the ground. He poured himself coffee and stared at the piles of documents spread across his table, the deed, the survey maps, every legal paper he could find. None of them mentioned an HOA. None of them granted anyone permission to build anything, but he knew that logic meant nothing if the system itself was corrupt. He called an old friend, Aaron Bishop, a lawyer who specialized in corporate compliance, and explained what had happened. Aaron listened in stunned silence before saying, "Max, if they forged your signature and changed your zoning classification, that's criminal, but you're not going to win this alone. You'll need someone who actually works property law in that county." He gave him a name, Grace Shield. She was young but had a reputation for tearing through bureaucracy like a scalpel. That afternoon, Max drove into the neighboring city and found her office on the second floor of an old brick building that smelled faintly of dust and coffee. Grace was nothing like the lawyers he remembered from his tech days. She wore jeans, a dark blazer, and had eyes that looked like they'd forgotten how to be surprised. She let him talk for nearly 20 minutes without interrupting, occasionally jotting notes. When he finished, she leaned back and said, "I've dealt with Ridgewood HOA before. They're small-time predators who figured out how to play in the gray zone between public zoning and private development. They manipulate land records, push through minor legislative adjustments, and suddenly your forest becomes their community project." She stood and walked to a filing cabinet, pulling out a folder marked Ridgewood Cases. Inside were half a dozen printouts of lawsuits, most dismissed before reaching trial. "They pick targets they think won't fight back," she said. "Retirees, absentee owners, or people living off the grid. They file liens faster than anyone can respond, and by the time it reaches a courtroom, the land's already improved, making it legally irreversible." Max felt the weight of her words settle like stone in his chest. "So, what can we do?" he asked. Grace tapped her pen against her chin. "First, we need proof of forgery. The county recorder's office keeps digital timestamp records of every property document. If that signature was added later, we'll find it." They spent the next 2 days combing through records, driving between the county courthouse and the planning commission. Each office felt the same, airless, beige, staffed with people who spoke in careful half-phrases. Most of them claimed ignorance, but one clerk, a nervous man with thinning hair, hesitated just long enough when Grace mentioned Section 3.4 of the Community Enhancement Agreement. Later, outside the building, Grace turned to Max and said quietly, "He knows something. I'll file an open records request tomorrow. If they've been hiding correspondence with developers, we'll drag it into daylight." The following week was a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and frustration. Every document they requested came back redacted, every inquiry answered with vague language about ongoing development proceedings. Yet late one night, Grace called Max with a tremor of excitement in her voice. "I found it," she said, "an internal memo from Ridgewood's planning board. It's dated 3 months before you bought the property. It references a pending partnership between Ridgewood HOA and a company called Greenpath Developments." Max frowned. "Greenpath?" "They're a construction firm that specializes in luxury recreational communities," Grace said, "and according to this memo, your land was listed as Phase 1 of their expansion plan." He felt a chill crawl up his spine. "You're saying they were already planning this before I even owned the property?" "Exactly," Grace said. "They didn't just find a loophole, they created one, expecting you to fall into it." Over the next days, Grace dug deeper, tracing the network of connections between the HOA board members and Greenpath's executives. What she uncovered was worse than either of them expected. The president of Ridgewood's zoning committee was married to Greenpath's regional manager. Daniela Sloan's brother-in-law worked for a title processing firm that handled the integration paperwork. It was all neatly circular, every signature validating another. Grace printed it all out and spread the pages across her desk like a crime board. "This isn't negligence," she said. "It's organized fraud." Max stared at the pattern of names and arrows connecting them, realizing that his forest wasn't just collateral damage, it was bait. He drove back to his land that evening with a new kind of anger, colder and more focused. The forest had always been his refuge, but now it was evidence. He walked the perimeter with a flashlight, photographing every stake, every machine, every section of disturbed soil. When he reached the stream, he found a new structure, metal pipes running through the water, redirecting the flow toward the cleared area. It wasn't just construction. They were altering the ecosystem. He crouched by the stream, the flashlight trembling slightly in his hand, and whispered to no one, "Not anymore." The next morning, Grace filed a cease and desist order with the county court, demanding an immediate halt to construction until ownership disputes were resolved. Within 48 hours, the bulldozers stopped. For the first time in weeks, silence returned to the woods. Max felt a brief, fragile victory settle over him. But it didn't last. 2 days later, a black SUV pulled into his driveway. Daniela Sloan stepped out, flanked by 2 men in suits who looked like they'd been hired for intimidation rather than negotiation. She greeted him with that same infuriating calm. "Mr. Lancaster," she said, "I understand you filed legal action. I want to give you an opportunity to resolve this without unnecessary conflict." Max crossed his arms. "The only resolution I want is you off my land." Daniela sighed softly, as if she were the one being inconvenienced. "You're making this far more complicated than it needs to be. The Ridgewood community values cooperation. The improvements being made will benefit everyone, including you. You could even profit from it." She handed him a folder. Inside was a proposal offering him a partnership stake in the golf course's operation, 5% of future revenue in exchange for transferring his deed to the HOA's trust. He looked up at her, disbelief giving way to disgust. "You're trying to buy me out of my own property." She tilted her head slightly. "Think of it as an opportunity to be part of something bigger than yourself." He threw the folder back into her hands. "I didn't come here to be part of anything. I came here to get away from people like you." Her expression didn't change, but something in her eyes hardened, a glint of contempt slipping through the mask. "Then I hope you're prepared for the consequences of isolation," she said, turning toward her car. As she drove away, the SUV's tires kicked up dust that hung in the air long after she was gone, and Max knew that the silence around him had changed again. It was no longer peace, but warning. That night, he and Grace met at his cabin. She reviewed the documents from the proposal, her brow furrowed. "They're desperate," she said. "If they're offering money, it means the injunction hurt them, but it also means they're going to escalate." Max nodded. "Then so will I." He told her about the pipes in the stream, the machines that had already crossed the boundary markers. Grace took a long breath, her voice low. "You realize, Max, that this isn't just about your land anymore. If we expose this, it could bring the entire Ridgewood HOA down. They'll fight like hell to stop that." He stared into the fire burning in his hearth, the shadows dancing against the walls, and said quietly, "Then we make sure they burn first." The next morning, while the fog still hung low over the trees, Grace sent their findings to a journalist she trusted, a local reporter known for exposing small-town corruption. By noon, the first headlines appeared online. "Private citizen alleges land fraud in Ridgewood development." It wasn't national news, but it was enough to make the HOA nervous. By evening, Grace's inbox was flooded with emails from other residents who had similar stories. Smaller plots, strange fees, unexplained integration clauses. The pattern was unmistakable. Ridgewood wasn't a neighborhood anymore. It was an enterprise, and Max, unwillingly, had become the man standing in its way. By the end of that week, the illusion of peace around Max's forest had completely evaporated. What had once been the soft murmur of wind through pine needles was now replaced by the mechanical groan of engines starting at dawn and stopping only after dark. The cease and desist order, which had given him a few days of quiet, had been overturned through an emergency appeal filed by the Ridgewood HOA. Grace warned him that this kind of maneuver meant they were calling in favors, using connections that reached higher than any local office. The morning after the ruling, Max found a new sign at the edge of his property. Construction resumes under judicial authorization. The paper was laminated, official, and signed again by Daniela Sloan. His first instinct was to rip it down, but Grace told him not to. "Let them document their arrogance," she said over the phone. "Every move they make from now on helps us prove intent." Her voice was calm, but Max could hear the fatigue behind it. They were both running on anger and coffee, bound by the same growing realization that this was no longer a simple property dispute. It was a war of attrition. Later that day, as Max walked toward the stream to check whether the diverted pipes had been removed, he saw that the water had changed color. What was once clear and cold was now murky, streaked with silt and oil. When he followed the pipe uphill, he found a newly installed pump system, its hoses snaking through the underbrush toward the golf course clearing. It was bleeding his water supply dry. He turned the valve shut and cut the hoses with an axe, watching oily water spill onto the ground like proof of his defiance. An hour later, a black SUV pulled into his driveway. Two men in security uniforms stepped out and took photographs of the damaged pipes without acknowledging him. When he demanded to know who sent them, one of them simply said, "You're interfering with authorized work, sir. That's a violation under Section 9. Max felt his pulse hammer in his temples. "This is my land," he shouted. The man met his gaze with a look of professional boredom. "Not according to the current map." They left without another word, leaving behind the quiet certainty that he had just been catalogued as a problem, not a person. That evening, Grace arrived unannounced, her eyes sharp but shadowed by exhaustion. She had driven 3 hours straight from a county meeting where, as she explained, Ridgewood's representatives had presented new zoning adjustments that conveniently placed his parcel within a community infrastructure corridor. The move had been approved without public notice, effectively legalizing every action they had already taken. "They're rewriting the rules faster than we can challenge them," she said, slamming a stack of documents onto his table. "But we're not done. There's a hearing in 2 weeks. If we can prove that they used falsified environmental data or violated federal water protection statutes, we can freeze the development again." Max stared at the papers, the words blurring together into lines of bureaucratic poison. "So I just sit here and watch them dig up my forest for another 2 weeks?" She looked at him, her expression a mixture of sympathy and warning. "You survive the next 2 weeks. That's what you do." But survival was becoming more complicated by the hour. 2 nights later, Max woke to the sound of the movement outside. At first, he thought it was deer in the brush, but then came the metallic clatter of something being dropped. Tools, maybe. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped onto the porch. The beam caught the glint of reflective vests moving near his shed. "Hey!" he shouted. The figures froze, then bolted into the woods. He chased after them just far enough to see the taillights of a truck vanishing down the dirt road. When he returned to the shed, the padlock hung twisted, the door half open. Inside, several of his fuel cans were missing, and the generator wires had been cut. It wasn't vandalism, it was sabotage. The next morning, he reported it to the sheriff's department, but the deputy who arrived barely looked around before telling him it was probably kids messing around. Max tried to explain the pattern, the threats, the ongoing dispute with the HOA, but the deputy's polite indifference made it clear he wasn't going to interfere. As he drove away, Max noticed a small Ridgewood sticker on the back of the patrol car's window. Grace urged him to document everything. She helped him install motion cameras along the property's perimeter, each connected to a cloud server outside the county's jurisdiction. For a while, the footage showed nothing but raccoons and wind-stirred branches. Then, one night, it caught something else. 3 men unloading equipment from a truck bearing the Ridgewood logo. They dug near the boundary markers, setting up what looked like survey poles. When Max sent the footage to Grace, she immediately recognized it for what it was. "They're trying to establish a new boundary line before the hearing," she said. "If they can prove your property overlaps with HOA easements, the judge could rule that their presence was lawful all along." The next morning, Max confronted the workers in person. He walked straight into the clearing, ignoring the shouted warnings, and pulled the stakes out of the ground one by one. One of the men reached for his radio, muttering something about calling the authorities. Max stared him down, voice low but steady. "Call whoever you want. Just make sure they bring a warrant this time." The man hesitated, then backed off, muttering under his breath as they loaded their equipment and left. That confrontation marked a shift. Within days, the HOA filed a complaint accusing Max of destruction of property and interference with authorized development. The fine totaled $15,000. Grace advised him not to pay a cent. "They're baiting you," she said. "If you pay, you validate their authority." Instead, she filed a counterclaim and contacted an environmental protection agency, presenting evidence that Ridgewood had diverted a natural waterway without a permit. The agency sent inspectors within 48 hours. When they arrived, their presence sent shockwaves through the Ridgewood offices. Max watched from a distance as the inspectors walked the site, photographing the pipes and the erosion near the stream. For the first time, he saw panic in the workers' faces. Later that evening, Grace called him with restrained excitement. "They found violations, multiple ones. We have leverage now, but we have to move fast before they bury the evidence." 2 days later, a reporter from a regional newspaper showed up at his gate. She was young, sharp-eyed, and unafraid to get her boots muddy. Her article appeared online that weekend under the headline, "Tech Veteran Battles HOA Over Illegal Golf Course on Private Land." It went viral faster than either of them expected. Messages flooded Grace's inbox. Strangers offered support, donations, and their own stories of HOA harassment. For the first time, Max felt something close to hope, though it was tempered by exhaustion. That hope lasted until Monday morning, when he woke to find his mailbox smashed and a spray-painted message on his fence. "Pay your dues or pay the price." The words dripped black and uneven against the wood, a reminder that even as truth began to surface, the people behind Ridgewood were willing to get their hands dirty. That night, as the forest settled into uneasy silence, Max sat on his porch staring at the faint lights of the construction site in the distance. Somewhere beyond the trees, engines idled, men spoke in low voices, and the air smelled of cut grass and gasoline. He knew now that the legal battle was only one part of the fight. The rest would be about endurance. How long he could hold out before the system wore him down or the fear took root deep enough to make him surrender. Grace's words echoed in his mind. "You survive the next 2 weeks." He tightened his grip on the mug in his hands and whispered into the darkness, not as a vow, but as a warning. "I'm not going anywhere." The courthouse smelled faintly of dust and disinfectant, that sterile blend of bureaucracy and age that clung to every hallway like a warning. Max had barely slept the night before. The hearing was scheduled for 9 a.m., and Grace had arrived at dawn, her car filled with binders, maps, and printed photographs. She looked tired but fierce, her dark hair tied back, her voice low and sharp as she rehearsed the key points one last time. "They're going to try to drown us in jargon," she said, her tone clipped with focus. "Don't interrupt. Let me do the talking. The evidence will speak for itself." Max nodded, his throat dry, the weight of months of conflict pressing on his chest. He wasn't afraid of losing property anymore. He was afraid of watching truth collapse under the weight of money and influence. When they entered the courtroom, Daniela Sloan was already there, perfectly composed in a charcoal suit, flanked by 2 lawyers from a high-end firm in the city. She greeted him with a polite nod, a gesture that felt less like civility and more like triumph. The judge, an older man with silver hair and an expression carved from patience, began by reviewing the motions filed by both sides. Grace spoke first, laying out the foundation of their case: the forged signature, the illegal redirection of waterways, the environmental violations confirmed by state inspectors, and the chain of financial ties linking the Ridgewood HOA to Greenpath. Developments? She presented each piece of evidence methodically, her calm precision a deliberate contrast to the murky language of the defense. When she projected the photographs of the diverted stream onto the courtroom screen, the judge leaned forward. "And these were taken where, exactly?" he asked. "Within the plaintiff's registered boundaries," Grace replied. Boundaries confirmed by county records prior to the unauthorized reclassification. The opposing counsel objected, claiming that the reclassification had been lawful, citing community benefit clauses and mutual integration agreements. Grace anticipated it. She lifted a single page and said evenly, "Then perhaps the court can explain why this signature, supposedly Mr. Lancaster's consent, is dated 2 months before he even purchased the land." The room went silent. Daniela shifted slightly, a flicker of discomfort breaking her flawless composure. Grace didn't stop. She pulled another exhibit from her folder, an internal memo between Ridgewood's zoning board and Greenpath executives discussing parcel absorption strategy and referencing Max's land by number. This memo, Grace said, was obtained through a public records request. It outlines plans to incorporate private property into a development zone by exploiting ambiguous jurisdictional language. It's fraud disguised as procedure. The defense lawyer stood, objecting again, this time accusing Grace of misinterpreting administrative language. But the judge held up a hand. "I can interpret it myself," he said quietly. The silence that followed was heavier than any shout. When it was Daniela's turn to speak, her tone was calm, rehearsed, almost patronizing. She argued that the project had been approved democratically, that Mr. Lancaster had benefited from community improvements, that any confusion stemmed from incomplete communication during the transitional phase. Her words flowed like oil, smooth and reflective, but Grace cut through them with precision. "Improvement?" she repeated, rising to her feet. "You bulldozed protected forest, contaminated a natural stream, and threatened a private citizen with financial ruin. You call that improvement?" The judge glanced at Daniela. "Ms. Sloan, I have one question," he said. "Did the Ridgewood HOA or Greenpath obtain written consent from Mr. Lancaster before commencing construction?" Daniela hesitated for the first time. "We believed the consent was implicit through jurisdictional inclusion," she said. The judge's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Implicit consent," he echoed, the words heavy with disbelief. Grace took that pause like a cue. She opened another folder, revealing the statement of the environmental inspector who had visited the property. His written testimony described deliberate concealment of drainage infrastructure, falsified maps, and undisclosed construction beyond permitted zones. "Your Honor," she said softly, "this isn't negligence. It's calculated abuse of authority." The courtroom was silent except for the faint hum of the overhead lights. Max sat motionless, his pulse thudding in his ears. For months he had felt powerless, trapped in a maze of bureaucracy, but now he watched the walls of that maze begin to crack. The judge leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against the bench. "I've seen a lot of creative interpretations of property law in my time," he said slowly, "but I've never seen one quite this ambitious." He turned his gaze toward Daniela. "Your organization took it upon itself to appropriate private land, falsify consent, and then penalize the rightful owner for objecting. That is not community management. That is exploitation." He paused, his voice steady but cutting. "The court finds in favor of the plaintiff. All ongoing construction on Mr. Lancaster's property is to cease immediately. Any structures or alterations made without written authorization are to be dismantled at the expense of the Ridgewood HOA and its development partners." A murmur rippled through the room. Grace exhaled slowly, the first sign of relief crossing her face. The judge wasn't finished. "Furthermore," he added, "given the evidence of forgery and environmental violations, I am referring this case to the county prosecutor's office for criminal review." Daniela's composure fractured just slightly, a tightening of the jaw, a flicker in her eyes, but it was enough. The defense attorney began whispering furiously, but the damage was done. Grace gathered her papers calmly, her movements efficient and precise. Max stood, his legs unsteady, the enormity of the moment settling over him like the first breath after a long drowning. When they stepped outside, the morning sun hit them like a baptism. Grace turned to him, smiling faintly for the first time in weeks. "It's not over," she said, "but it's ours now." Max looked toward the horizon, where the tree line of his forest rose against the sky. For the first time in months, it wasn't a battlefield. It was home again. The weeks that followed the verdict felt strangely unreal to Max, as if time had slowed to let the land itself breathe again after months of suffocation. The machines were gone, their ruts in the soil slowly filling with rainwater and new shoots of grass. The pipes that had bled the stream dry were dismantled, the water returning to its old path with a quiet persistence that reminded him of resilience itself. From his porch, he could finally hear the forest again, the creak of branches, the distant call of birds that had fled during the construction, the murmur of life rebuilding itself without permission or apology. Grace visited often, her usual sharpness softened by exhaustion but laced with quiet satisfaction. She told him the county prosecutor had opened a formal investigation into Ridgewood HOA and Greenpath, that subpoenas were being issued, that Daniela Sloan had resigned for personal reasons. The association's board fractured soon after, members turning on each other in panicked self-preservation. What had once been a monolith of control was now just noise and paperwork collapsing under its own weight. But victory, Max realized, didn't feel like triumph. It felt like aftermath. The silence he had once sought now carried ghosts, the echo of engines, the memory of anger, the smell of diesel buried under damp earth. He walked the perimeter each evening, checking the boundaries not because he expected another intrusion, but because habit had replaced peace. Grace urged him to sell part of the land, to invest in fencing or security systems, but he shook his head. "I didn't fight to turn it into a fortress," he said quietly. "I fought so it could stay what it was." Still, he agreed to one change. Near the edge of the property, where the first fairway had once been cut into the trees, he placed a wooden sign hand-carved from fallen oak. Private reserve, protected land, trespassing prohibited. Beneath it, smaller letters read, "Property of M. Lancaster, established 2025. It wasn't a threat or a warning, just a statement of fact. This land belonged to him again, in every sense that mattered. One evening, as a twilight spilled through the branches, Grace stood beside him by the stream. "You know," she said, watching the water shimmer, "you could turn this place into a sanctuary. People would donate to help restore it." Max smiled faintly. "Maybe someday," he said. "For now, I just want to listen to it heal." She nodded, understanding more than she said. When she left, the forest swallowed her footsteps, And for the first time since the ordeal began, Max didn't feel the need to look over his shoulder. The air was cool, tinged with the scent of pine and earth after rain. He sat by the water until night fell, the stars reflected on its surface like scattered embers, and realized that what he had reclaimed was more than land. It was proof that resistance still mattered, that even against institutions built on arrogance and greed, one person's refusal to yield could still mean something. He had come here searching for silence, but what he found instead was voice. The steady, grounded kind that comes from knowing exactly where you stand and refusing to move.